Hey everybody, Cindy Daychuk here with Queen Bee Creations. Thanks for tuning in today. I have had requests for, and I guess a lot of questions about painting fabrics and painting chairs with fabric seats and those kinds of things. I did do one with a leather seat, so you've seen that. I do have some earlier ones of me painting a big wingback chair, which was pretty much all fabric, but we're gonna get to work on this little guy. So what I have done is I have washed it all already. And what I did do with the seat is I vacuumed it off, and then I've taken a wet rag and I've wiped it all down. So it's as clean as I can possibly get. The fabric is in good shape, but it is a textured fabric. So there's almost like little tiny fleur-de-lis kind of patterning on this. You're still gonna see that when you paint it. So if you've got little raised designs, no, you're not eliminating that. You're not, you're not getting rid of that. It kind of creates some of the interest, but you do wanna start with fabric that at least is in good shape. If it's got rips, it's got tears, it's still going to have rips and tears when it's painted. So you want something that might not be the color you're looking for, but. Now, with this and in selecting your colors, you could go white with this, but no, it's going to take many coats, and odds are it's not going to be pure white. You're still going to see hints of this color through it, so just kind of bear that in mind. Because again, you don't want to have layered, you don't want 12 layers of paint on this. But the first step really for us is I want to seal this wood. I'm not 100% sure yet exactly what color I'm going with on this. I think part of it depends on what I end up doing with the seat. But I do know that it's old, and so I'm going to take some Salvation solution from DIY, and I just happen to have clear open, so I'm going to use that. And I'm just going to take my chip brush and I'm going to paint all of my wood just so that I don't end up with any bleed through on this piece. It's an old chair. I got this from the thrift store, so I don't know the history. It smells fine, meaning I'm not getting a lot of cigarette smoke or that kind of thing, but I'm going to be putting some work into this, in which case I really don't want to put all that work in and then find I have bleed through. So it just makes sense to, on pieces like this, to just take the extra time, seal it up first, and then we'll go from there. Now, one of the reasons that I'm using clear on this is because I don't know if I'm going to be doing any distressing. And if I distress, then I want to be able to see the wood, in which case doing the white would just kind of inhibit that. So, you know, think about some of the look that you're after. If you're painting this and you're just looking for nice solid coverage, then, you know, especially if you were painting it white and you just want a nice solid coverage, then you might as well have that prime coat, that seal coat in the white, which means you're going to have to paint fewer white coats over top of the dark wood. It just helps. So I'm just going to get this all done and then come back at you. I mean, when I come back at you, it's going to look like I did nothing, but you know I did. Our next step with this chair is we're going to start out by painting the fabric. For me, it's easier because it's the messiest part. We're using really watered down paint. We're going to be sanding it between coats, that kind of thing. I find it easier to do it, get it done, and then to be able to paint around it. I don't know, maybe other people find it easier the other way, doing it last, but it's the messiest part. There's a lot of water involved, and I just find it easiest. Plus, it gives me a better idea of how my colors are working with the fabric. So if I'm having a hard time covering this over, I need to go a different route, it allows me to kind of change my plan with the wood. That said, we want to work a little bit wet. We want our fabric to be damp, but we don't want things to be soaking. So sometimes people tend to use a little too much water. Now this is a mister, so even when it looks like it's a lot of water, it's not. And even then, it's all sitting up on top of this fabric. So I'm just looking at getting, a little bit of dampness happening, but we're going to be mixing up watered down paint. So I'm looking and doing this in mint chips. So I'm going fairly light on the main part of the chair. So we'll see how many coats that requires. I mean, the nice thing about DIY is it's heavily pigmented paint, so it does have good staining properties and things. I'm just going to mix up a little to start. I can always mix up more, right? I just don't have a need for tons of watered down paint afterward. So I'd rather be mixing more up as I go than mixing a huge big container and then not needing it all. So I would probably say, like, that's pretty runny. It's probably 2 to 1, 2 parts water to 1 part paint. And I want it fairly loose. I would rather do multiple thin coats than try and do a couple of heavy coats. We want to be staining, we want to be dyeing our fabrics. We want it to kind of soak in without totally saturating everything. But I'd rather have small layers. If it's really, really thick, it's just going to sit on the surface, and then subsequent coats are just going to be sitting and layering on top. That's not what we want. That's where we run the risk of things, cracking up. Now I'm taking my brush and I am dipping it completely in the water because it hasn't been wet yet. But I'm now shaking out all that water, and I am wiping my brush off on my drop cloth. I want it wet too, but I don't want it soaking, right? So I'm just going to dip it into my paint, and then I'm going to use swirling motions to be able to get that paint down into that fabric. And here, don't race this process. Don't slap it on and go. That's okay when you're doing it on a flat surface like wood, but we really want to work this down into it. And you can see why I didn't want to have that painted yet. Because there's just no way I can see to be able to get that in. So I tend to hold my brush nice and low so that I can have better control, and I can really kind of push that paint down into my fabric. And I'm just going to keep swirling it on. So you can see already I'm getting pretty good coverage. I can still see this has got kind of almost like a scallop shell pattern, and then little dots in between each of those scallops. So I can still see that pattern coming through. You would never expect that you're only going to need 1 coat of this. So I'm definitely going to be needing multiple coats. We just don't know how many yet. But again, you're just working it down. If you find that this starts getting a little bit too dry before you get to it, you could spritz it again. But again, I prefer like a mister than a spray bottle where I'm really adding that paint in really heavy. Once I get this coat of paint on, I'm going to want this to dry overnight. I want it to be really pretty much dried to the touch. Doesn't mean on the inside it's fully dry, but I want it to be dry to the touch because our next step is going to be sanding. So I don't want to be moving wet paint around. So it's good to, when you're doing a project like this, don't expect you're doing this all in one day. Not possible. You don't want to be drying this with a heat gun either. I find that it's way better to let this dry naturally. So I'm gonna carry on, get my coat on, and I'll come back at ya tomorrow when we've got it dry so that we can do our sanding and our next coat and see what kind of coverage we're getting at that stage. This is day 2. So this has had one full day overnight to dry. So you can hear, it's okay, but we have to loosen up some of that paint. So we are going to kind of lightly sand this. And already, as soon as you do that, you can feel that you've knocked off some of those rough edges where some of the paint was just sitting on top. As soon as we've got that done, I will wipe it all down, kind of flick it all off, get as much of that dust off. You can also take your vacuum and vacuum it off. And then we are going to apply another coat. So that is the process through all of this. You can see that this is a lot lighter than it looked yesterday. That's because it's all soaked in. So you're gonna keep putting the paint in, that watered down paint, letting it dry, sanding it, dusting it off, applying your watered down paint. You're gonna keep that process going, finishing with a sand and a dust. So the last thing you do is that you're gonna sand it a little bit softer and dust it all off. But you're gonna keep that cycle going until you have the color that you want. There's no guessing how many coats that is. It depends upon the fabric, the base color, the color that you're going to, the type of paint that you're using, all those fun things. But the last thing that you're gonna do is you're gonna sand it all smooth and dust it all off, ready for the sealing. I'm not gonna seal this until I start doing the rest of the painting, but I'm gonna carry on with getting this sanded, dusted off, and get another coat on to let it dry overnight, because I really can't do anything else until I have the seat cushion done. Not a hard process, but with the dry time in between, could be lengthy. I have so far put 5 light coats onto this, and I'm preparing to put on the 6th, which I think is likely going to be the final coat. I've already sanded and dusted it off, so we're going to lightly mist it just to help this last coat get in there a little bit better. And then I'm going to add on my watered down paint. Now, you can see that there's paint on the rest of the chair. I just tend to, when I finished applying the paint, cleaning my brush off onto the chair, because it's gonna need paint anyway. So I'm just, helping it out. So I would say all told, so for my 6 really light coats, I have maybe used a total of about 1/3 to 1/2 cup of DIY paint in total. So by the time that I've diluted it down and I've added really light coats, it hasn't taken very much paint at all. The light coats are a better way to go because you're really then staining the fabric rather than laying in tons and tons of paint, which is what you want to do. And when they're light, it doesn't take long to dry. So I have been able to get, easily 2 coats on there a day. And I think there was one day that I was here long enough, I got 3. So as long as it's totally dry to the touch, you can sand it, get rid of the dust, and then you can paint again. So it doesn't take long. If you have really saturated your chair, you're gonna find that you wait overnight and your chair is still damp. You are using way too much water. Okay, so, you know, as much as I've got really watered down paint and as much as I'm really working it down into the fabric, which is key because I don't want it sitting on top, I want it sitting in the fabric. It's not going to take a lot of paint because, and this is one of the reasons that I did this in the mint chip, was I wanted you to see the light paint going over top of dark fabric, because a lot of you always ask about whether or not that's possible, whether or not you can get full coverage, and so far it's pretty darn good. I expect that when I do the wax, I may get a little bit of an undertone of the darker color, which just means if I did plain, the plain mint chip on wood and held it up against it, this is going to look a little bit darker, just because it's got the darker color laid underneath it. That's to be expected. But you can see with these light coats, it's really sinking in and staining into the fabric just beautifully. And then I just clean off my brush. Our seat cushion is finished. We've got enough coats on that. It looks great, but I will tell you this. I had originally thought that I was going to be doing this in like bohemian blue, like a dark teal. I was going to do a much deeper, richer color, maybe taking some of this green up and blending it in. I changed my mind. I painted out, you guys saw that, you know, when I had excess paint in my brush, I just kind of painted it out here to be able to create, to empty my brush out and create a little bit of a base for my other paint to be able to stick to. But what happened is I kind of love it in the pale colors. I'm thinking it looks a little bit more feminine. So what I've decided to do, change of plans. I'm actually going to paint all of the wood white. So I'm going to use Beadboard by DIY and then maybe highlight some of these details in gold. I just think now I'm kind of loving how this lighter color has sort of lightened the whole piece up. It's become a little bit more feminine. So I'm going to do 2 coats of beadboard on all of this, and then we'll get back together. I'll probably do a little bit of distressing, maybe do a little bit of gold. I'd like to say that I have a plan, but now my plan has completely changed and I'm faking it. So I'm going to continue putting on the white paint over this. Really, I'm going to get good coverage with one, but because it's white, I'll definitely want to do that second coat, and then yeah, we'll get back together. But I'm kind of digging it this way. It's the way it goes. That picture that I just showed you was some bleed through, and it was kind of a weird reddish orangey kind of colored bleed through, and I got it coming through on this handle a lot, a little bit across the front and a little bit on this handle, nowhere else, just there. So what I did do is I took some shellac and sprayed that just over those spots, and I layered 2 more coats of paint over top. The only reason I did 2 coats was because I want to sand a little bit right now, and I just to smooth out the feel of the paint, take off a little bit of those, you know, microscopic highs, and I needed enough paint to be able to do that and not reveal the shellac and the bleed through again. Originally I had thought if I go to the white I will do a bunch of distressing, and I thought that would highlight a lot of these details. The bleed through changes that plan, because if I've got the bleed through happening in some spots, I could likely get it in others. Now, you'll recall the very first thing we did with this was we sealed this piece. We used Salvation Solution, which is awesome, but there's no product that gets out 100% of the bleed through. Sometimes you need multiple layers or coats of it. So as much as we did all over, and I only had the issue in some specific spots that I spot treated with the shellac and more paint. It doesn't mean that if I sanded right down to the wood that I wouldn't create other issues, because now I'm going down through that layer of Salvation Solution potentially, and I'm going to expose whatever was causing the bleed through. So it sort of leaves me with no distressing. In which case, I am going to get this sanded and sealed up. So I am going to be using clear wax by DIY all over all of the wood, and I will wax that all up first because it's white, and then I will use exactly the same wax on this. I expect on here that my brush that I'm applying the wax on will get a little bit pale green, which is okay, because it's not sealed yet. Once it's sealed and that wax has a chance to dry, you're not going to get any of that paint coming off. You're not going to get any of that wax coming off if somebody's sitting on your chair. But I just want to lightly sand all of this to smooth it out. And it's not going to take more than, one quick pass with 320 grit sandpaper just to lightly knock off any of those highs. And it gives a better hand feel when people are sitting on the chair. It doesn't have that slightly rough texture. So I'm going to sand all of that down. I'm going to take my cloth and I'm going to wipe it all down, and just to get the dust off before we seal it. And then I'll come back at you and just to have you there for a little bit of the sealing in particular on the fabric. And then I'm thinking we still want to highlight this a little bit. So I have a couple of other plans since the distressing went a little bit awry on us. So we've got a couple more steps to do, but it's looking very light, very feminine. So I'm happy, apart from the bleed through. To wax this piece, I'm gonna take a brush, and I'm just going to simply be applying the wax all over. Now, I tend to use very little wax to begin with, and I really just move that wax around the piece a lot. So it means I have very little to wipe down later. And I just find it's a better way to go. DIY paint is so easy to be able to wax. One, because it helps, it kind of absorbs in there, but you can see where you've waxed. It will take on a slightly different, a slightly darker hue. It'll lighten up as it starts to dry, but it allows you to be able to see where you've waxed, where you haven't. So, it makes your work a lot easier because you're not re-waxing places that you already have. Now you can always add more coats of wax as you go. That's perfectly fine. So let this one dry and harden. You can add another layer for a little bit more protection. So don't think that it's has to be just one and that's it. If you want more protection, then you can certainly add extra layers. But I find that the wax gives a really nice hard surface. If you were wanting to use a polyacrylic on this, you might get into some problems, just because we know it's already kind of tending to bleed through things, and the poly will tend to pull that out a little bit more. So I feel a little bit better and safer using wax for this, which is what I would have used I was planning on using anyway, just because I'm going to be waxing the fabric, and you know, it's just for continuity, and also because it's my preferred finish. I like the way that it feels on furniture pieces. I like the way that it wears, but you know, it's up to you. The only thing that you wouldn't do, because this is white, is use a like a shellac over the top of this. You can use the shellac underneath your paint layers as a blocker, but you can't use it over top of your white pieces because it will yellow over time. So if you want them to stay white, you're not going to be finishing them with your shellac. So I'm going to get this all waxed, and I will wipe it down with a clean white lint-free rag, and then I'll come back at you when it's time to move on to our fabric, because I think that's the piece that people want to see more than me just waxing the wood, as you've probably seen, you know, 100 other times. So I'll come back at you when it's time for the fabric and for our detailing phase. So since I can't distress it to highlight anything. When it comes to waxing your furniture, you know, you on your flat surfaces, you could use a brush to apply your wax. You could use a lint-free rag to apply your wax. But when it comes to the fabric, you really need to have a bristle brush, and one that you're not going to mind really kind of working down in to the fibers. So you can see that it's going to deepen that color again. It'll lighten a bit as it dries, but what I want to do is really work that wax down into the fabric. I don't want to just lightly apply it over the top and have it sitting on the top. I want it going down into the fibers, sealing all of that paint that's down in there. So I'm going to be using that same swirling motion to apply that wax. I'm going to let it dry. I'm going to apply the wax, and then I'm just going to lightly wipe it off, just in case there's a layer that's just sitting on the top. And then I'm going to leave it to dry, and it will absorb that wax. When you come to feel it, like you'll feel it now, and it might feel, well, actually it feels pretty good, but it might feel a little damp. And then tomorrow you'll come in and you're not going to feel any of it at all. So it's just a matter of really kind of going slow, working in small spots, a little bit of wax. I have very little wax on my brush at all, but just working it down into all of those fibers. And again, easy to tell where you've applied the wax and where you haven't. You can see the two-tone difference. So just make sure that it's all completely covered. White back excess, if there happens to be any, let it dry overnight. So last steps for this piece is really kind of the desire to accent it a little bit, dress it up a little bit, especially since we can't distress it. So I'm taking DIY Golden Ticket, and I'm going to highlight all of those details using a light coating of that Golden Ticket. So I'm going to paint it on all these raised surfaces. There's grooves that go down on these legs and up in here, and I'll put the Golden Ticket in there. So we are dressing it up a little bit, giving it a little bit of bling, since it doesn't have the distressing. So I'm just going to kind of carefully paint this on, and I'm just going to go for the top of the raised surfaces. I'm not looking at trying to get down into all of the sides, except when it comes to here, because, you know, and like here, I'm not going to do all the side of this, I don't think. I'll just do the top of it, and we'll see how it looks. And, you know, I reserve the right to change my mind yet again. But because we're not going to do any of the distressing, I wanted to add some additional touches to kind of give it a little bit more of a feminine look since we went into the lighter tones with this. And I think that highlighting some of that detail up there with that light coating of gold is going to do that. It's going to make it a little bit more special. So here's our finished chair. I think it turned out really cute. It was definitely different than the plan that I had in my head, but sometimes these things just take on a life of their own. You just kind of go with the plan that they have in mind. And once I saw the mint chip kind of base coat on this, I decided I wanted it to go light. I wanted to keep it kind of feminine. I think the light gold helps set it off, and it's just kind of super sweet now. This is all perfectly dry, perfectly comfortable. It's sealed. You could sit on it. I will probably add, now that this has had a chance to dry, I'll probably add another layer of wax onto it and let that soak in and dry in, just for additional protection to the fabric itself. But no concerns with sitting on it. You're not going to leave with a big wax butt mark on you. It soaks into the fabric itself, it dries in there, and it's good to go. So there's no problem with being able to paint your fabric, but just do it smart. This is perfectly comfortable because it's been sanded, but again, I did 6 really light coats to be able to cover, going from dark to light. Going from light to dark, you're not going to need as many coats, but this was a textured fabric and it was a dark fabric, and way better success doing really light coats and just layering it on multiple times. Over the course of a day, if you had this in your house and you were doing it, you'd be able to have it dry probably 3-4 times over the course of a day, no problem. So it's not like 6 layers is layered out over 6 days and it's adding significant time in being able to finish a piece. The lighter the coat, the faster it's going to dry. It's when you really saturate your fabric and then you add a really heavy coat on and it's got a lot of water, it could take days for one coat to be able to dry. Just, you're using a little bit of misting to be able to loosen up the fibers in the fabric, to be able to accept the dye, thinning down your paint so it is a dye, using the right paint. We're not using an acrylic or a plastic coated paint to be able to do this. Then it's just going to seal over top and you're probably going to get cracking down the road. So DIY is a perfect paint for this because it is so heavily pigmented. You're able to get this kind of intense color far easier than any other paint, but other chalk paints work just as well, and I've used them in the past with great success. I hope that you give it a try. I hope that this has shown you it's nothing to shy away from. It's nothing scary about doing it, and how quickly and how well it can transform a piece. As long as you've got a piece of fabric on here that's in good shape, then you're good to go. Let me know if you give it a try, and until next time, take care.